our first conference, Conference A, Transitions in a Fragmented and Unstable Agri-Food System. I would like to invite to the table Professor Madeleine Fairbairn, Professor Yejin Zong, and Professor Allison Loconto. So, Professor Madeleine is Professor of Sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz, internationally recognized scholar in land financialization, agrarian political economy, and contemporary capitalism. Her research focuses on how finance and new property regimes are reshaping land markets, agriculture, and rural relations. She is the author of widely cited works and an active member of international research networks on agriculture development and global finance. Professor Yejin Zong is professor of sociology at China Agricultural University, one of the leading scholars in rural sociology in China. In fact, president of the Chinese Association of Rural Sociology, I am correct? Yeah. And research focus on rural transformations, rural-urban migration, land governance, poverty, and social inequalities in the context of China's economic reforms. He's the author of numerous books and articles on rural development and rural revitalization. And finally, Professor Allison Loconto is a sociologist and senior researcher at the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment, the INRAE, member of the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association, in fact, the Vice President of the International Sociological Association, and of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee of the Sustainable Food System Program of the One Planet Network. Her research focused on how standards and coordination instruments shape markets, production practices, power relations, and sustainability transformations. I really thank you all for this opportunity to listen to your presentations. We'll start with Professor Madeleine. And questions, we will organize a system with a QR code in order you can connect a form and send your questions. With this quantity of people, it would be very hard to pass the microphone, so you can ask your question using this form with your cell phones. Professor Madeleine, thank you so much.
Thank you. Buenos dias, bom dia. It's wonderful to be here with you all. And in fact, I was so excited to be invited to speak with you that I decided to present on all of my research. So time will tell whether that was a good choice. Buckle up. All right. Okay, so when I think about the theme of this panel, which is transitions in a fragmented and unstable food system, I think immediately about investment. The first is the big increase in farmland investing worldwide that began around 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis coincided with a global food crisis and rising commodity prices and therefore land values. And the second is venture capital's increasing interest in agricultural technology investment, which is often dated to 2012 or 2013, at least in the US, in Silicon Valley. Though these are quite different trends, I'm going to argue that they both have potential to majorly impact agricultural systems and therefore are really important to understand. I have 3 very small children, so I'm in the US phase of my research program right now. But I think many of these trends have global implications, though always contextually specific, of course. So investment wave number 1 is farmland investment. I'm going to start here. In 2021, Land Report magazine in the US surprised a lot of people by reporting that the software tycoon Bill Gates had become America's #1 largest individual farmland owner, with 270,000 acres of farmland to his name. A lot of really breathless reporting followed this discovery, and more journalists called me than have ever called me in my life. And everyone was trying to figure out Bill Gates's motives, nefarious or philanthropic. But the reality was really very mundane, that the asset management company that manages Bill Gates's billions of dollars of wealth had decided that farmland was a good investment. And in this, they're not alone. Many institutional investors, such as pension funds, hedge funds, and university endowments, have been making the same decision recently. The most famous example, perhaps, is the giant pension fund, TIAA, Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, which began buying farmland only in 2007. It now owns 800,000 acres in the US alone, much more than Gates, and over 3 million acres globally across multiple continents, worth about $14 billion. In a newspaper interview, a TIAA executive explained the company's approach to farmland, comparing it to other alternative asset classes that have now become mainstream. He said, "This is just another asset class that has the potential of going the route that real estate, private equity, hedge funds did in the past." So these are all alternative asset classes that now are invested in all the time by mainstream investors. In line with this quote, beginning around 2008, we see a proliferation of graphics like this one from The Economist, comparing farmland favorably to more established asset classes. This graphic, and many others like it, convey the idea that farmland is just another investment option which investors should consider as part of a sensible approach to portfolio diversification, along with the S&P 500, the US stock market, along with gold. And I heard this sentiment echoed in interviews with investors who said things like, we're constantly comparing farmland to more established asset classes, more familiar to investors, saying things like, geographically, among the commodity crop properties, the lowest risk would be in the Midwest. It's kind of the treasury bill of farmland. Or, I tell people that I come from a bond background, and to me, timber is like a zero coupon 30-year bond. Row crops are like a 1-year duration income-bearing money market fund. I find statements like this fascinating because they take land, which of course is this heterogeneous amalgamation of soil and water and plant life and unpredictable insects and unruly microbes, and which furthermore is embedded in a web of social relations with tenants, with farm workers, with neighbors, and they reduce it essentially to its financial risk and return. They distill, or they attempt to distill it to just another asset class. So I'm going to try, there's a lot to say about this. This process is still in its early stages, it's still incomplete, and there's still a lot of work being done by the investment community, narrative and others, to legitimize this project. But I'm going to talk now about some of the potential impacts. First, the environmental impacts. For investors, the investors that I've interviewed, a huge part of the reason to buy farmland is, yes, it's the rental income, but a lot of it is about the land appreciation over time. And much of this appreciation is, of course, expected to occur passively with the passage of time, with population growth, with development, the unearned increment, as Mills termed it. But the investors also work actively to create this appreciation through land improvement. This means that they're always trying to bring the farms in their portfolio to higher value uses. Now, hypothetically, bringing land to higher value uses could lead to more sustainable land use. So for instance, this California and Northwestern US-based fund, Farmland LP, generates value by having its tenant farmers bring the land in its portfolio through the time-consuming and onerous organic certification process, so that when they resell the land, it is now as organic farmland, which is much more valuable than conventional farmland. So in this case, they are adding value to the land in an environmentally sustainable way. And if you listen to investors, practically everything they do will always, adding value is always good for the land. But most of the time, I would argue, land appreciation is going to be achieved through an intensification of production, furthering the trajectory toward ever more capital and input-dependent agriculture. I first truly understood the environmental implications of treating land as a financial asset when working with colleagues on a case study of farmland investment in California's Cuyama Valley. In 2014, Harvard Management Company, which manages the massive endowment of America's richest university, Harvard, it was then about $40 billion, now it's more like 60, I think, purchased an 8,000-acre parcel in California's Cuyama Valley and immediately began transforming part of it, about 1,000 acres, into an irrigated vineyard. You can see there the valley there. And on the right, you can see just a little corner of the vineyard that was just a couple of years old at that point. What was so striking about this land acquisition was that the investors chose to create this irrigated vineyard in a place that was experiencing a massive water crisis. The Cuyama Valley gets just a few inches of rain per year. It's semi-arid. It also has very little surface water, so that all of the agricultural production that exists there is groundwater dependent. It depends on pumping groundwater. And this has been going on for long enough that that there's been massive subsidence of the land, massive drawdown of the water basin, and currently water is being extracted at twice the rate of recharge. On top of this, at the time that Harvard made this purchase, California was in the middle of a massive drought, multi-year drought. With climate change, California has been experiencing more and more droughts. And this was the moment when Harvard decided to buy land in an overdrafted water basin and drill massive wells to create an irrigated vineyard. And this makes sense from the financialized logic of the farmland investor, in which farmland is just another asset class. Irrigated vineyards sell for 10 to 20 times more than unirrigated pasture land that they were replacing. So by building all that irrigation infrastructure, the investors were locking in land price appreciation. Community members, however, pointed out that in this case, bringing land to these higher value uses, improving the land in the language of investors, was occurring at the expense of local environments and community. In community meetings we attended, they explicitly called out how Harvard's speculative approach to land was based on extraction. They said, "It's all a fairly obvious extractive endeavor. I support farmers' rights to farm. I don't believe that this is about farming. I believe it's about financial extraction." Or another said, "Our major concern with this whole project is this is a real estate deal masquerading as an agricultural project. And we're afraid that the next round of discussions we're going to have before the board is how they're going to split this property up and subdivide it off into little ranchettes so that none of us have any water." In fact, this community member was wrong. Harvard did not subdivide the property for development. In fact, since our project wrapped up, they've actually been doing exploratory drilling for oil. This story to me is particularly striking because Harvard really explicitly bills itself as a sustainable and long-term investor. This is a screenshot from their website. They talk everywhere about environmental and social governance, their ESG investing. They are an investor for the long term, they say. They've even divested their university endowment from fossil fuels, which I don't understand how that's compatible with exploring for oil. It appears from this case at least that a sustainable long-term approach to farmland investing means profiting despite or even because of ongoing environmental harms, such as those caused by climate change, rather than actually working to counter those harms in any way. So these are some of the environmental implications, I think, of this approach to farmland. What about social impacts? A second reason this trend of farmland assetization matters is that it will have major social consequences, essentially shaping who gets to be a farmer. In the US, as in many countries, there has been this ongoing process of farm sector consolidation over the last 100 years, where the number of farmers has dropped precipitously and average farm size has grown in tandem. And it seems likely that this consolidation will only be heightened as small and beginning farmers find themselves in competition for land with multi-billion-dollar financial institutions. This issue has even been getting press coverage in places like the New York Times. But importantly, this process of farm sector consolidation also has racial dimensions. In the US, the number of black farmers has dropped much more steeply over time than the number of white farmers. Although small farmers have declined, among white farmers, the amount of total land farmed by white people has stayed roughly the same, or owned by white people, whereas the amount of land owned by black farmers has declined. And this is because black farmers faced all the same technological and policy pressures as their white counterparts, but they also face massive institutionalized racism in attaining government assistance and loans, for instance. My PhD student, Elsa Calderon, and I, in collaboration with the National Family Farms Coalition and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, have been doing research to try to understand how this pre-existing precarity and vulnerability of black land ownership may be interacting with growing investor appetite for land in the Mississippi Delta. You can see Mississippi there. It's sort of the northwestern region of Mississippi. The Delta is a region with a lot of black farmers compared to the rest of the US, and it's also been generating a lot of hype in the farmland investment community. This hype is in part actually because of California drying up. The Delta has abundant water because of the Mississippi River, and so some investors see it as having the potential to become the next California when it comes to fruit and vegetable production. So in this research project, I've been analyzing property data for the region while Elsa has been doing interviews with black farmers and landowners to try to understand how they're being affected by investment. So what we found is first that financial institutions are indeed ubiquitous in the region. I put this here, I know this is impossible to read and it means nothing to you, but I put it here because it took so much work to make this freaking table. Me and a whole bunch of undergrads have spent hundreds of hours looking at the property, thousands of parcel entries for just 6 counties in the Mississippi Delta, because land ownership data is so untransparent that you have to become essentially an investigative journalist to understand who owns the land. So a single owner, like you can see TIAA there, owns land through 7 different LLCs, 7 different limited liability companies. Or you have UBS farmland investors through 5 different LLCs with names that have nothing to do with UBS. You have to figure it out based on mailing addresses and other things. But this is what it looks like. This is one county, Bolivar County or Bolivar, as they say, in Mississippi. Bolivar County is 64% black, according to the US Census. And in this county alone, TIAA has bought 36,000 acres of land. But there are also a bunch of other smaller, quote unquote, land deals. They're actually huge. We've got UBS farmland partners, we've got Manulife investment managers, two of the oldest farmland and asset managers in the US. We've also got some of the newer actors like Acre Trader, which is a farmland trading platform. There's Germany-based AgriWorld. We've also got, you can see here, Oak River Farms, which is Bill Gates. And all in all, just about 10% of Bolivar County land is now owned by investors. And in all of these cases, most of this land seems to have been acquired in the last 15 years. This is another county just to the north, Coahoma County. Again, majority black. Again, close to 10% of land now owned by investors. Our interviews suggest that these big investors are probably not targeting Black-owned land. This was sort of the question of our research partners, the Federation and the National Family Farms Coalition, is are they directly dispossessing Black farmers? And the answer seems to be no. Many, for the most part, they seem to be really targeting large properties, many of which are white-owned or corporate-owned already. But they still indirectly impact farmland access for Black farmers. Interviewees described land access challenges that were really bad and getting much worse with time. For instance, one county official whose job involves working with land records explained to Elsa, a good bit of the Mississippi land in this area that's sold recently has been bought by investment firms. Most of them are out of state. One of the larger ones that we see is from Colorado, and they're buying land and they're paying money that the local farmers can never even think about paying. Land has gone from being $2,000 an acre to right now it's bringing $5,000 an acre, just in the past few years. The local farmer, the family farmer is just being priced out, but these investment firms are purchasing it and then the rent is going way up right now. This research is still ongoing, but so far for us, it's really confirming that investor interest in land is likely to increase land access challenges for the most marginalized American farming communities. All right, wave number 2. Another major project I've done with a group of researchers has looked at the emergence of agri-food technology investing in California's Silicon Valley. And we're particularly interested in the potential of this type of investing to create positive food system change. The industry certainly sees itself as having the potential to create positive change. As you can see in this photo I took at a San Francisco biotech accelerator, which kind of captures the almost godlike power that the industry thinks it has to change the world for the better. Since Silicon Valley got seriously interested in food and ag tech in the early 2010s, it has been widely touted for its potential to fix a broken food system. You see articles like this, that tech is going to fix agriculture, that it's going to challenge the agribusiness giants that are such a problem in our existing system. And these claims have certainly appealed to venture capital. We see this huge increase in venture capital investing across food and ag tech from just a couple $1 billion in 2010, 2011 to a peak of $50 billion during the pandemic. Delivery robots and stuff. And now it's sort of come down a bit, but is still in the teens or $20 billion every year of venture capital investing into ag. But, and this is all based on the idea that it's going to disrupt the food system, the way that Uber disrupted taxis, or the way that Airbnb disrupted hotels. But of course, existing food system scholarship suggests this is not the case, that work of people like Phil Howard, Jennifer Clapp, John Wilkinson, we see that in fact, existing agribusinesses are acquiring startups, are buying the startups that are supposedly going to disrupt them, that they're investing in those startups. So here, this is an image from a paper by Phil Howard and colleagues showing major meat companies investing in alternative protein startups, so startups making lab-grown meat. But this work tends to focus on these discrete, publicly reported moments of interaction between these established firms, what I'll call incumbent firms, and startups. So when an acquisition happens or when an investment happens. And if you look to research in economic sociology and geography, there's a lot of work on startups which suggests that they're not a fully formed thing. They don't just come into the world fully formed and eventually become acquired. They're actually very malleable works in progress that are constantly changing in reaction to all the interactions they have. In particular, they are shaped by investors. This work really emphasizes how they are, as Koyman says, they are imprinted by venture capital to conform to the venture capitalist logic of hypergrowth, of assetization, of the need for an exit for investors. Or as Jesse Goldstein says, he compares startups to dressage horses, the horses that dance for their riders. And he says that startups Founders are trained like dressage horses, are disciplined by venture capital to perform in ways that will produce a fast growth and exit in investor profits. And so drawing from these two literatures, we find that, in fact, the influence of established companies, of incumbents, is everywhere in Silicon Valley. It's not something that just happens when a startup is acquired by an incumbent agribusiness. It is something that happens constantly. Incumbent influence is ambient in Silicon Valley. They are everywhere at the conferences. You can see Cargill, ADM, Corteva on the background of this talk. They are sponsoring the hackathons. They are judging the pitch competitions. Their voices are ambient throughout the sector. Their influence is also continuous on startups. From the moment they are formed, they are being influenced by these investors. So, for instance, the incubators and accelerator programs that do business development, that help startup founders develop a business plan and market their startup, often have all of these corporate partners. This is one, Thrive, which has a page all about its corporate sponsors. Or another one told us, it's a very corporate-driven accelerator, so all these big companies sit on our board and tell us how to run the program, and we do it for their benefit, essentially. These accelerators and incubators explicitly are grooming startups to meet the needs of incumbent agribusinesses throughout the course of their life. And finally, incumbent influence is frequently indirect, in the sense that it affects even those startups that never have any interaction with incumbent companies. So this is most evident in the way that many companies talk about the formation of the sector as growing directly out of Monsanto's billion-dollar blockbuster acquisition of the ag data startup Climate Corporation in 2013. One venture capitalist told us, when Monsanto bought Climate Corp for $1 billion, all of a sudden now every Silicon Valley startup was like, oh, we're doing digital ag. Even though we don't know anything about agriculture, but we want to be a billionaire, so we're going to apply our knowledge of all this AI stuff and put it to farming. So we really see this kind of potential of being of a blockbuster buyout by a existing agribusiness as actually calling startups into being, as being the reason they even exist in the first place. So why are these big established firms so important to Silicon Valley? Our research suggests that startups and the venture capitalists that invest in them gravitate toward these corporate partnerships largely because food and agriculture is such a materially and socially complex industry. One food tech entrepreneur explained how this complexity led many startups to contemplate a corporate acquisition as their easiest path forward. He said, "The food industry is not an easy place to succeed, and the margins are razor thin. By the time the product reaches the consumer, you've got to get over 50 massive hurdles. It is a complicated industry to succeed in, and in the end of the day, it wears most people down. And exit, selling to an incumbent, becomes the most viable way for them to scale. Because why go try to build all these partnerships and distribution relationships and pay everyone a little fee if you can just get acquired by Nestle, make your investors happy, and plug into their existing system and hopefully do the right thing and change the world?" So, these startups may have incredible technologies, they may have visions of idealistic visions even of how to change the food system, but incumbents have production expertise, product formulation expertise, they have distribution networks, they have trust with farmers, they have established supply chains, and you can't build those things in the time frame expected by venture capital. So here's where we kind of circle back to those dressage horses, that economic sociology literature. In many ways, we found that incumbent influence, that this agribusiness influence operates through venture capital. It is precisely because venture capital funders demand rapid growth and marketization from the startups they fund that working with incumbents becomes a logical, almost an inescapable choice for entrepreneurs. So for instance, one venture capitalist explained that incumbents have a ton of assets that we can leverage to go faster and do more in a shorter period of time. And many VCs we interviewed actually described facilitating relationships with incumbent firms as the main part of their job. While some startups may be able to withstand the intertwined venture capital and incumbent influence to maintain their original idealism, many cannot. This is the example I always think of, you may have heard of. Plantix is a crop damage detection app that was created by German soil scientists who were really passionate about biological control and other non-chemical approaches to plant pests, and initially saw their technology as a way of making organic pest and disease control recommendations to small farmers. But eventually, after visiting Silicon Valley and getting a couple rounds of venture capital funding, they settled into a platform model in which their business model is essentially that they are a pesticide sales platform. You take a picture of your damaged crop and it tells you which pesticides to buy. They're now selling pesticides to smallholder farmers all over India. And finally, in 2024, they were acquired by German agrochemical company Helm. So there went their idealism. So I'm going to try to make some tentative conclusions about all of my research. The conclusions I draw from these two projects is, first, I think it's important to note that investors are not all the same. They have very different profit expectations, timeframes of investment, and cultural norms distinctive to their particular investment community. A pension fund is not the same as venture capital, and these produce different outcomes. However, looking at these two waves of investment, I think we can see certain commonalities. To me, they're both expressions of rentier capitalism, which Brett Christophers defines as a mode of economic organization in which success is based principally on what you control, not what you do. For the pension funds and university endowments investing in farmland, the strategy is to accumulate assets in the form of land and water rights and collect literal ground rent. For the venture capitalists investing in tech startups, the strategy is to collect assets in the form of patents that enable you to collect rents from licensing fees, or online platforms that entitle you to collect user and subscriber fees. In either case, the goal is to monopolize assets and to collect rent from ownership of those assets. Powerful investors promote themselves as the purveyors of a more sustainable food future, but their models tend to produce more of the status quo. In fact, I would argue they can only produce more of the status quo of agricultural intensification and corporate concentration. There are social movements out there in California, in Mississippi, in Brazil, imagining and asserting genuinely different futures for the food system, futures of mutual aid, of redistributive land reform and commoning, and genuine climate action. But these genuinely alternative food futures can never be brought about by rentier capitalism. The revolution will not be funded by venture capital, or, for that matter, by pension funds or hedge funds. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine, for this wonderful presentation. We move forward with Professor Yejing Zhong. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for the organizers. It's so great pleasure to be here. And I also thank my colleagues from China who are so supportive to join this important conference, because we have 3 deans of the sociology department of the top university currently, Professor Li, Wenjun, and Deng. And also Professor Wang, they are so supportive. And we have more than 30 participants from China to come here. So I thank you both sides. So the theme of, thank you. Okay, the theme of this conference is about transition of agri-food system. And in my opinion, the food system is closely associated with the agrarian structure. Therefore, I put the title of my presentation, China's Agrarian Structure and Food System from 1949 to present. Okay, I will first present some background information in terms of national specific conditions and key events in China's development, followed by agrarian structure and key transformations, and food system and key transitions. And finally, I will give some about future orientation and some reflections. Okay, the first part, the first part, national condition and key events in development. And China now has 1.9 billion mu of arable land. This mu is Chinese unit for land area, and 1 hectare is 15 mu. And this makes 29 million hectares of arable land for all China. So arable land, if we say per capita of all Chinese people, per capita in China, it's just less than 0.1 hectare. And in fact, rural land is only distributed to the people who are registered in rural communities. And these people registered in rural communities amounted to about 860 million. Therefore, among these 860 million people who have land, the per person land holding is only about 0.15 hectares. So this is a very specific condition to be known for China. Okay, this is the population growth since 1949, and by 2025, the total population is 1.4 billion, of which 954 million living in the urban. And as I said, 451 million living in the rural, which makes the urbanization rate in China now is 67%. And the rural population started to decline at the year of 1996. The right diagram is the arable land area, and the criteria for land survey might be different during the different survey period. So therefore, you see the discontinuous line, but roughly the arable land area maintains without decline due to the very strict protection measures in order to ensure food security. And the area ranges from 1.9 to 2 billion mu. Okay, these are the key events in China's development since 1949, which lead to the major periodization of China's development into 2 major periods, before 1978 and after 1978, as China started reform and opening to the world in the year 1978. And before 1978, 1953 could be also a turning point, because since 1953, the collectivization started. And after 1978, 2000 and 2001 could be a turning point, because China gained accessing to the world WTO in 2001. And in addition, 2020 could be also a turning point as the pandemic emerged and the global geopolitical situation became quite turbulent. And there are many important events happened during these different periods, but I will not explain in detail. However, these events have hugely impacted on the agrarian and food system in China, as well as their transformation and transition. Therefore, I first show you this different periodization. In general, China has been doing very well with economic growth, especially for the recent 40 years. You see, this is the GDP and GDP in total and per capita. Okay. Now the second part of my presentation is China's agrarian structure and key transformations. We can also periodize China's agrarian transformation into 4 periods. First, as I said before, that 1949 to 1953, and then 1953 to 1978, and then 78 onwards and 2013 onwards. I will explain in detail. Okay. Before 1949, China had private ownership of property with large disparities in people's living standards and access to resources, especially in rural areas. as a largely agrarian country with 90% of the population living in the countryside, peasants had strong grievances over the land tenure. This is because landlords who accounted for only 10% of the population but owned 70 to 80% of rural land, whereas poor peasants, tenants, and farm laborers who made up 90% of the population only owned 20 to 30% of rural land, which could be the case in many parts of the world at the moment. Shortly after the Communist Party came to power in 1949, we carried out a radical land reform that gave land ownership to poor tenant farmers. As a result, 300 million peasants received 50 million hectares of land, which was about 45% of the total arable land of the country. So the new China, ruled by the Communist Party, did achieve its objective of land to the tiller. And this land reform eliminated the landlord system in the countryside, equalized land ownership within villages, broke the domination of the landlord gentry class, and transferred power for the first time to the poor peasants and tenants. And landlords as a class were wiped out by mass peasant struggles against them. And land was confiscated and redistributed to peasants. And these peasants obtained the private land ownership. As a result, agriculture in China was transformed from landlord-owned farms worked by tenants and hired laborers to smallholder, family-based peasant farming. The peasantry had direct control over their own means of agricultural production. So the land reform had hugely developed agricultural production, which was a precondition for the subsequent agricultural collectivization and the country's industrialization. So since 1953 onwards, China underwent a process of collectivization or socialist transformation from small private holding into large-scale communes. The collectivization has both positive sides and negative sides. However, the very important change in this collectivization process is to change the rural land ownership from individual private peasants to collective ownership. And such a collective ownership of rural land remains unchanged till now and will remain unchanged for the future as the policy stipulates. And here, the collective generally refer to rural community or villages. Okay, this collective system was broken up in 1978 as an innovation from the grassroots level. The household responsibility system was established, and this system allowed peasant households to contract land and manage agricultural production on their own initiative, not as a commune anymore, while the farmland remained in the ownership of the rural collective. And land was therefore redistributed in all villages in China again. In-household responsibility system does not refer to the usual market term or lease. It is the entitlement of rights over land that every peasant has. It can be understood that peasants will get land from the collective, everybody, and they have to farm, and they pay some agricultural tax. So in practice, the redistribution was operated by firstly categorize village arable land into several classes according to land fertility and productivity. Then each plot or each category with different fertility and productivity will be distributed to everybody in the village, evenly according to the members of the family, the numbers of family members. So this means each household in a village would have several small plots, very fragmented. And this system enabled Chinese peasants to use land under long-term contract. No matter where you migrate, no matter what the capital would do, peasants will have the legal protection for their contract land or their land contract rights. Agriculture in this period achieved rapid growth. As a result, the problem of food scarcity was resolved in short time, and the number of poverty population was reduced by nearly 165 million from 1978 to 1990. According to Justin Lin, who was chief economist of World Bank before, and his research shows that for the increase of agricultural output from 1978 to 1949, 47% was attributed to this institutional reform, household responsibility system, and 32% was attributed to the use of fertilizer. So some challenges have emerged during the process of household responsibility system, particularly land fragmentation. To respond to these challenges, some innovations have been trialed. For instance, land transfer. So land transfer refers to the transfer of land use rights, and that is peasants who own land contract rights from the collective, but transfer the use rights of the land to other economic entities. And more than 1/3 of peasants have transferred out of their land. It has to be noted that the state policy has extremely clear stipulations that any land transfer to any entity or capital holder is only within given period, and no land can be transferred if peasants do not agree. This means land is still in the hand of peasants. Okay, now the third part, China's food system and key transitions. As food system includes production, processing, consumption, circulation, I will briefly cover these themes. And here, food includes grains, oil seeds, meat, poultry, eggs, dairy, and aquatic products. And in China, when we say grain, it normally is a broad category. It includes cereals, legumes, and tubers. Okay, first about food production. In China, the transition of food production can be delineated as 5 phases. That is private small production from 1949 to 1953, and collectivized plant production from 1953 to 78, and household production and multiple job holdings, the term from Professor Yang Douwe van der Ploeg, from 1978 to 2000, and scaled expansion and globalization from 2001 to 2020, and emerging agricultural entities and full chain supply from 2020 onwards. I will not have time to go into details. Yeah, and here is a diagram of grain production. And you will see that the crop planting area remained quite stable, and the total grain output and grain output per capita continued to grow almost every year. In 2025, the total grain production in China reached to 714 million tons, and grain production per capita reached to 508 kilograms. As this is a diagram of food production, including grains, oil seeds, and sugar crops, fruits, vegetable, meat, poultry, and eggs, dairy, and aquatic products. And one can clearly see that the trend of diversification and differentiation. And for instance, in the year of 2025, the total meat production in China reached to 101 million tons, and the total fruit production reached to 354 million tons, and total vegetable production reached to 888 million tons, so on and so forth. And here is food production per capita. It's the same trend you will see. Okay, for food processing, from food processing, one can clearly see the transitions from minimum processing to industrialization, large-scale production, and diversification over the past 70 years. Again, I will not go into detail. And let me come to food consumption. And for food consumption, we can also see the transitions clearly from eating enough to eating well, meaning before we had poverty, our people cannot eat enough, and then we eat well. That was the year from 1949 to 1993, and then from eating well to eating healthily from 1993 to 2013, and pursuing dietary balance from 2013 to 2024. Okay, here is a diagram of the change of consumption of different types of food over past 70 years. We can clearly see the salient decline of grain consumption, but also the consumption increase of fruit, vegetable, meat, poultry, eggs, dairy, and aquatic products. And for food circulation, China went through different phases representing multiple transitions. And in general, we can see the trend from domestic closure to a globally integrated modern circulation system. And here is the China total retail sales of consumer goods, and showing sharp increase since the year of 2000. And this is the China's rural online retail sales. And from 2012 to 2025, it grew from 100 billion yuan to 3 trillion yuan, showing about 30 times increase. And this is China's imports of wheat, soya, and corn. In 2025, China imported 3.8 million tons of wheat and 111 tons of soya and 3 million tons of corn. And here is the export. We can see that we did export some corn around the year of 2000, and now mainly some rice. And here is the major grain importing countries. And clearly, Brazil ranked #1, and China imported 83 million tons of grain from Brazil in 2025, and quite some meat too. So by the year of 2025, China remained the world's largest agricultural product importer and became the world's 5th largest agricultural product exporter. So the above presented food system and key transitions in China have been largely supported by the state and state policy. This is a point I have to mention. And this diagram shows that financial support from the government to the agrarian sector, one can see a sharp increase since the year of 2000. And in 2024, the national fiscal expenditure on agriculture, forestry, and water conservancy totaled approximately 2.5 trillion yuan, and $1 is about 7 yuan. Okay, finally, the final part of my presentation, let me first briefly talk about the future orientation of food system in China. And in our 15th five-year plan, that is from 2026 to 2030, we have formulated key goals concerning food systems, including enhance overall agricultural production capacity and build a diversified food supply system, and implement policies to strengthen agriculture and benefit farmers, and safeguard national food security, and ensure basic self-sufficiency in grain, and strengthen food safety supervision and improve the food safety accountability system. And for realizing this objective, we have designed concrete measures and series of measures, very sophisticated, comprehensive. For instance, in terms of farmland, we will strictly safeguard the farmland red line. We have red line. In terms of production, we will uphold the principle of relying primarily on domestic production, ensuring production capacity making appropriate use of imports, and strengthening technology support, and also ensure basic grain self-sufficiency and absolute security of staple food supply. We will need to stabilize rice and wheat production while increase maize and soya production capacity. We shall develop food resources through multiple channels and expand new sources of alternative proteins. And therefore, there is a projection that by the year of 2030, there will be 25% reduction in China's soybean imports. And by 2040, there will be 14 to 16% of domestic beef and seafood market captured by alternative proteins in China. And by 2050, there will be 35 to 55% of domestic animal protein demand made by alternative proteins. And there are many other measures designed very comprehensive, as I said. Okay, finally, some reflection very briefly. First, I think the agrarian structure, particularly the successful agrarian reform in China, has been the foundation for a sustainable, diversified, stable, and resilient food system. It has also been the foundation of China's 40 years economic growth and rural development. Therefore, I think agrarian reform is of critical importance. I know in Brazil, people are also pursuing agrarian reform. Second, the long-term stable development plan is particularly important for agriculture and food production. Since 1949, we have formulated 15 five-year plans with huge continuities. As a result, the state is able to concentrate its efforts in development of agriculture and production and the countryside. Therefore, you see continuity in both agrarian transformation and food system transition in China, as I presented. Third, China's experience has shown that smallholder family farming is very essential in agricultural production and food provision. It plays an irreplaceable role in stabilizing agricultural production and food provision, and also promoting rural social harmony and practicing agroecology. And fourth, the state and state policy need to support the development of agriculture and food production, the countryside and people's living livelihoods. In China, the government has attached great importance to agrarian issues and food security, and China has prioritized the development of agriculture and food production in rural areas in its overall development agenda. In fact, the subject of land, peasant agriculture, food, and rural development are highly policy sensitive. We cannot leave their fate alone or to the capital or to the so-called free market. It is the state and state policy that have to intervene. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ye. Last but not least, Professor Allison Loconto.
Bom dia, tudo bem? We're still here. So I noticed we have about 45 minutes left, so I'm not going to speak for all of them. And I'm going to try to talk through some of the things that me and my colleagues have been working on in Europe. And so it's very nice to have this kind of global talk around the different types of food systems and different types of initiatives that are going on. And I'm going to talk specifically about something that I have been working on that I call Transitions in the Making. And in order to get there, I'm going to start with kind of where we are. And so I opened up ISA's 5th Sociology Forum of Sociology in Rabat, Morocco last summer with this image that was used in 2018 by a local French radio program. And it's this image of the West that's eaten up the world to make itself fat. And this is basically the essence of the debates about the Anthropocene, which was the topic of the forum last summer. And the discussion that I wanted to put into place last summer and carries on even into even to today, is that within global sociology and, let's say, mainstream sociology more broadly, the questions that we deal with in rural sociology and sociology of agriculture and food have never really been considered to be mainstream sociological concerns. And I think that those of us who are here in the room today, we know that this really isn't the case, and it can't be the case, and that's part of the problem. So in my own research, which I have been focusing on kind of understanding how societies are governing the reorganization of food systems so that they can become more sustainable, I do find this term, the Anthropocene, rather important one, because it does identify agriculture and the knowledge used to feed ourselves as one of the important material markers of the Anthropocene, but one that's been difficult to get into the global environmental agenda, particularly in the predominant discussions about climate change. So, for example, the IPCC did not consider the role of agriculture in its report until the 2000s, and the chickenized stratigraphic record, discussed by Blanchette, offers a really interesting vision of, and prescient indeed, about the way in which the global agri-food system looked in 2015 when he published it, but also when these topics about the Anthropocene were really quite vibrant, those debates. And he described it as a system where the bodies of animals and the humans who slaughter them are reciprocally, I can't speak, shaped according to unfair working and living conditions, while the chemical and biological compositions of the air, water, land, and microbial communities within which they live are likewise irreversibly altered. Unfortunately, as we heard last night, 10 years later, our food systems have become even more concentrated globally, not less. And sustaining this established global socioeconomic order has itself evolved into a categorical imperative. And the politics of unsustainability has abandoned any attempt to change individual lifestyles or societal structures to comply with this eco-imperative of the Anthropocene. And instead, it focuses on managing this inevitable social, economic, and ecological consequences, thus the disasterism kind of ideas. So rather than trying to reverse the prevailing trends towards catastrophe, it really tries to promote technological solutionism. It's the techno-optimism. It's all of these investments in AI and other new technologies that are going to save us. And so despite many conferences that we've had over the years diagnosing this problem and prescribing the solutions, we really don't have political leaders who are willing to make the types of sweeping changes that we need in order to move away from what was well described last night by Jennifer, of this type of state of neoliberal consumer capitalism where we currently are today. So we had tried to talk through this, and many scholars of food and agriculture, we've been arguing about this for a very long time. And at the core of this narrative about the Anthropocene is this idea of transitioning from a broadly ecological perspective to one that defines thinking at the level of the entire Earth system, which requires different forms of knowledge. Who knows? Who can know? How can we know? How must we know to live and survive? And these types of questions we tried to pick up in this book that I edited with Doug Constance, and that we brought together from papers that were presented in the last IRSA conference in Cairns, Australia, and then also the fourth ISA forum that was supposed to have been held here in Porto Alegre, but then COVID happened and everything changed. But we did get the book out, and we did try to go through some of these questions that are there on the screen. And when we presented this at the RSS meeting in 2024, I think it was now, we had some very interesting debates. And so we decided to write a book review with Bill Lacey and Michael Bell about some of the debates that were brought up in that session, and also what the book brought up in some of the ways in which it didn't answer the questions that we proposed. And what Michael wrote in his part of this book review was that the chapters in the book most often showed that the current agri-food transitions are not dealing with the challenges posed to them, by the conditions of the Anthropocene, and that this evidence should be a warning to scientists and policymakers that the current approaches and even the current terminology is insufficient for the threat that the Anthropocene poses to societies as we know them. So some of the innovations and future-oriented policies in this book, I do have to say they do offer some glimmers of hope. We do have a little bit of hope in there. But it really would require us as sociologists, citizens, readers, and eaters on Earth to take up this challenge that's posed to us by a recognition of this different epoch that we're living in order to really become more engaged in documenting, studying, and challenging the dominant knowledge, environmental, and governance regimes. So we need to basically develop different methods and tools that facilitate this process. And if we think that counting resources is sufficient for accounting for how and why they're used by different actors, we're not going to be able to hold true to our ethical or epistemic values. And identifying and legitimizing situations where farmers come to know their environments in ways that do not privilege humans or individuals, and develop forms of governance where decision-making processes are counter-hegemonic is part of this type of scholarship that we must work on and continue to work on. So for the past 20 years, I have been observing and conducting participatory research with alternative agri-food initiatives across 5 continents. And I want to share here what grew out of that, which is a method for studying the governance of transitions, not after the fact, but in the making. So my argument starts with the question, when is a situation actually open to transformation? And I've come to see 4 features that, when empirically intertwined, signal that a situation is ripe for change. You have interdependencies that are often invisible to the actors themselves, but something happens in their worlds that allows them to begin to see these interdependencies. There are complexities about what to change and how to change, and so therefore there's a need to understand those complex interactions. There's uncertainties about the past, the present, and the future action. There's controversies among actors about the goals and the meanings of what they're doing. None of these is a problem to be eliminated. Together, they're the conditions that make change possible. So, a ripe situation, however, it doesn't transform itself. It requires that actors recognize 2 things. First, where we are, and where we want to be. And so the movement between those 2 states of being, that's what I mean by a transition. It's not a technology replacing another. It's a shift in this collective self-understanding that carries action with it. And so what my studies keep showing is that this movement doesn't happen spontaneously. It requires intermediation. Through intermediation by a diversity of actors about 4 things that effectively govern how transitions get made. So basically, we need to think about the values, the knowledge, the infrastructures, and the rules. And how we can begin, oops, you guys didn't see my intermediaries, sorry. There we are. This is us in India, where we actually started with the empty plot and turned it into, we all planted in one of our activities. And so it's about the way in which we need to begin to engage in these types of practices. And what we began to think about is that they emerge from communication through 2 different types of processes. So the first is the objectivation, which means that intermediation supports clarification and coordination that aim to objectify the issues at stake. And crucially, then we can trace this empirically through the material artifacts that circulate within their networks. The objects, they leave traces, if we quote Latour. The second is intersubjectivation. And this is Trago's term. Here, intermediation recognizes and reinforces the processes through which actors express their own subjectivity through the exchange and confrontation of opinions and arguments among those who shape a problem and care about resolving it. It's a reflexive awareness that arises in people through dialogue with others. So what does intermediation actually do then? It builds boundaries. And through intermediation, these actors construct the boundaries within which actionable knowledge can then be produced, and within which change can actually be made. This is where I think that governance of transitions is actually located. Not in the outcomes, but in this boundary work. Okay, so moving on from this, we started in 2021, and this is perhaps the longest publication process I've ever had in my life, through 4 very intense rounds of review that took 5 years. We finally were able to publish a paper that theorized this a way in which we can think through the conceptual development of these ideas and thinking through the ways in which we can recognize transformative change. And it was part of a special issue organized by Doug Robinson and Susanna Boras and Wouter Boon about reimagining diffusion, revisiting Rogers' framework of diffusion of innovations, and trying to think through what have we learned over the past, 50 some odd years, 60 years, about the way in which innovations get generalized across society. And so we tried in this work to bring such local level intermediation into play with literature on generalization of system innovations and transformative change that's found in the innovations policy literature. So our starting point here was that Weber and Rohrkascher, they had argued back in 2012 that there's quite a lot of directional failures in transformative change, particularly when it's tried to be planned and put into place. And they claim that these failures occur when there's a lack of shared knowledge to make choices between different possible trajectories. And they contend at times that collective priority setting processes break down, particularly when there's a disruption of the deliberation and when the diversity of options steers interactions towards conflict rather than convergence. And so in such context, we believe that the challenges can be identified and the intermediation can reconfigure the links between actors around a new object, thereby helping to create new connections that expand the network. And so we looked at the sociology of life course, actually, which is a very old theory as well, to try to better understand the winding trajectories. Trajectories are not linear, despite the graphs we like to show. They are winding, they turn, they don't necessarily go from the bottom left to the top right of a graph. And the way in which certain turning points were described that fit well at that point in time. When we started this, we were looking at 10 cases. We ended up with 3 that got into the paper. But we were looking at different types of food systems based on alternative forms of knowledge in France. And we therefore, in this way, looking through these cases that are retrospectively, in a sense that we started with very old cases and those that had actually transformed their system, we were able to then retrace and identify turning points along these trajectories. And we introduced then, with this paper and through this analysis, a notion of generalization as an intermediated trajectory to explain how the system innovations, like alternative food systems, and so the idea is that you're not having one technology, but you're having the system itself is an innovation, the way in which the actors are connected, and how that system moves and generalizes across different parts of the food system and across society. And so we responded in this paper to this idea of the existing literature that really focuses on diffusion and scaling, where human agency and steady progression seem to be the explanations of how we can create this change. And instead, we are proposing a relational object-oriented approach that highlights the role of this situated intermediation through punctuating and disrupting trajectories. So I'm going to go very fast through this because, and I continue not to share with you, because the time is not on my side. But I do want to talk to you about something that is important to everyone, wine. And because we looked at 3 different cases that ended up in the paper, and we chose extremely different cases as a way to demonstrate how this approach and conceptualization could apply well across a number of different aspects of food systems change. And so we were looking at sustainability in French food systems and how situations of changes were intermediated, and we looked at networking naturalness within wine production systems, knowing sustainability in pollinated field production, and including marginal actors in research and innovation on food systems. And so we looked at 3 parts of a socio-technical system that kind of are fundamental to the way in which food systems develop and generalize. And so each case describes a series of situations of change where intermediation resulted in opening the network to include new actors and progressively built the conditions of a turning point, and thus, we think, generalization of the system innovation. So, as you know, I'm sure, wine is one of the most pesticide-intensive agri-food systems in the world. So on average, French vineyards, they undergo roughly 12 to 18 chemical treatments per year, and that translates to a treatment frequency index of about 13.5. And so if we were, and what that means is that it's the sum of the actual applied pesticides divided by their maximum recommended doses. And so for comparison, since we're in Rio Grande do Sul, soybeans, the TFT for soybeans is 3.5 to 6. And we consider that soybean has quite a bit of pesticide applications. And so, in addition, the viticulture sector, it accounts for 20% of all of the pesticides sold in France. And even though the fact that vineyards cover less than 4% of agricultural land. So we're talking about an extremely pesticide-intensive production system here. And so natural wine, it grew up as this quiet alternative. It began informally in the 1960s, a handful of producers who simply refused the new chemicals that were brought into the system. No protection, no standards, no labels, just traditional methods, practiced pretty much unnoticed for many, many decades. Then in 1999, they had the first La Dive Bouteille, which was a tasting session. 15 producers, 100 guests, and they began a network of fairs, these tasting sessions, to bring together producers, consumers, traders, and people to begin to build a taste for this type of wine. By 2020, they have over 5,000 attendees and 250 producers participating. And in Paris, the natural wine retailers went from around 100 in 2010, which is already well into the progression, to, by 2023, 750. And they have an app that they also created called Realizada, which now maps 2,300 producers with 250,000 downloads behind it. So this network continues to increase and to really change the way in which French people are drinking wine. And so what drove this? There was a new kind of consumer. There's one who cares about pesticides, additives, and what actually is in the bottle. This, of course, we see this in many different alternative food networks. It's not enough. They're not just buying here, they're actually defining the category through participatory feedback mechanisms, but also they're changing their tastes. So natural wine, I don't know if anybody has tried a natural wine. There's a bit of a surprise every time you open the bottle. It could be completely vinegar, or it could be really amazing. And the surprise of opening the bottle is part of the experience, right? And so this is what the consumers are looking for. And so still to date, you know, they started in the 1960s, they've been progressively expanding mostly through the creation of markets. And through this, they still haven't created a standard. They still haven't created criteria for certification, nothing like that. They created a charter that is signed on by producers and retailers and the wholesalers, and it's called 20 méthodes nature. And so it has some ideas of what it means, but basically the boundaries are being set by the producers, the retailers, the drinkers, and they are basically setting the idea that you're not allowed to add anything from production to consumption. And so one of the things that a lot of consumers ask about, and this has to do with the complexity of the system itself, is that organic wine is well known. It's considered by many to be natural. But organic wine is able to reproduce the taste of conventional wine because they use approved additives and sulfites. This is not allowed in natural wine. And so they also make a differentiation between that. So the naturalness of the production also goes through the processing and into the way that it's consumed. And so, oops, there we go, that's what I want to show you. So what we see actually is a broader change within the way in which this is involved in food systems change as well as societal change. I mean, it's part of gentrification in Paris. It's part of the creation of these hippie communities, of a new type of ecological activists who's very strong. And so you have a lot of elements that go far beyond the food system that are coming into the way in which this food system itself maintains. But it's also, I mean, what we found is that it is substantial. So to move on, because I only have 5 minutes left, and I want to get to really where, what we're doing right now. So we created, we identified across the 3 cases that we analyzed, which were very quite different, these 4 conditions of identifying transformative change. So the stability of the trajectory, resistance, so the lack of resistance actually to the new trajectory, identity transformation of those who are involved, and then the role commitment, the way in which the different actors take on their roles in order to carry that on over time. We really expected to have these neat pairings between knowledge with stability, values and identity, infrastructure with resistance, and then rules with the roles, but it's really not what we found. Instead, it turned out to be a very hybrid and situated, of course, process. And so what matters really is that there's no single moment of intermediation that is enough to produce turning points. These are multiple, ongoing, hybridized actions, and it matters how actors build on prior intermediation experiences. In order to layer them until the conditions are met, that you're going to have a new direction in the trajectory. And so basically these cases also show another common pattern, that food systems, they're not just supply chains. Research and civil society and businesses are all part of producing the situated knowledge that spreads the innovation, and change is catalyzed by destabilization. It's always followed by restabilization in a new direction. And so you have this back and forth between throwing off the system, restabilizing it, and if things line up, moving in a new direction. And so, in addition, the people who are engaged, the intermediaries who are engaged, they're not neutral, they're absolutely interested in the outcomes of this process. So we learned a few things, and one of the points that I want to highlight, because of the next, I'm going to take about 5 minutes more, because I want to talk about what we're actually doing right now. And there are 2 elements here out of this work that really was of importance. That's not for him, okay. I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not talking about China. Okay, so 2 things came out of this that really prepared us for what we're working on right now. And the first one was rethinking the policy-appropriate rationales and strategies of policy intervention. And we need to indeed really think through the way in which the shifts in direction over time and the timing of intermediations really matter, and the way in which policy can help in that timing process. And then finally, the monitoring and evaluation. We have, some of my colleagues who I work with, they are economists working in a kind of evaluation of, impact evaluation of research, the way in which what we study, the knowledge we build actually gets adopted and can help to make societal change. And so one of the things that we've been really thinking about is, if we want to better understand how these transitions in the making are actually unfolding, we have to be part of those processes, to be able to identify them and then to monitor them over time. And there's a hope that we might be able to identify some of these leverage points, other ways in which we can identify the turning points without just being able to look into the past. How can we look at these in real time? And so now we're back to Europe, out of France and back to Europe. And basically, one of the things that we've started to do is to put these ideas into action. And so I don't know if you like I love that image. And for those of you who don't know, the farm to fork almost got smushed through the recent issues in COVID and the wars. But despite that, we have now 8 partnerships under the Food, Bioeconomy, Natural Resources, Agriculture and Environment sector of the Horizon Europe funding program, each of which have a different kind of mandate for financing research and innovation across Europe. There's about almost 9 billion invested in this for 10 years, starting in 2024 until 2033. To us researchers, this sounds really like a lot, but listening to the investments, it's like pennies. So we know what we're up against, but we're trying nonetheless. And so I'm highly involved in the agroecology partnership. And so agroecology, we have the mandate to team up and unlock the transition to agroecology so that farming systems are resilient, productive, and prosperous, place-sensitive, as well as climate, environment, ecosystem, biodiversity, and people-friendly by 2050. And so we have 111 partners from 31 states and regions, and about 300 million that's co-financed between our funders of research in our countries and the European Commission, in addition to Kenya and New Zealand, and we had Canada, and then there was financial trouble, but we're hoping Canada's going to come back. And so this is the way in which we're kind of setting up to be able to invest in research and innovation for this agroecological transition. Across this, we're focusing on the redesigning of agroecosystems and redesigning of value chains, particularly through these transformative policies and through living labs. I don't know if you guys have heard the word living lab before, but it's the idea that you have real-time experimentation between farmers and researchers, and that these actually continue over time. One of the problems in this literature is that they are project connected, and once the money runs out, the researcher loses interest, off they go, and the farmers are left alone again. The idea is that we're going to try to move out of that. What I am working on specifically is sorry, again, I talked a lot there, and you guys didn't see what I was looking at. So this is the way in which the strategic research and innovation agenda is set up. I have been working, I'm leading the work that's on the Science Policy Society dialogue. And I have a PhD student who is leading the work on, with CREA in Italia, on the measuring effectiveness and progressive changes. So I just want to share quickly with you how we've put through these ideas into what we're putting into place now, and we're going to be working on until 2033. So we have created the European Panel for Agroecological Transitions, which is a Science Policy Society interface, and we're hoping that this becomes a space for situated intermediation. So we're inviting experts from across 6 different domains of knowledge production, from research and education, but not only from there. Also from policy and public agencies at national, regional, and local levels, from the living labs themselves. Quite a number of living labs have been experimenting with creating policy at the local level. Civil society organizations, private sectors, organizations, and farmers and their organizations. We have had 2 of these already. The first one focused on the water nexus, the second one on the soil nexus, and this year we're going to be talking about European competitiveness and trying to deal with the questions of trade, of energy, of the way in which AI might be a space for a different type of intelligence, not just artificial. And so this is a place where we're trying to create these situations where we can begin to intermediate between different forms of knowledge. We also have developed a conceptual framework for monitoring agroecological transitions. And we start with this idea, and some of these, I mean, we've built on what already exists in terms of a number of tools, but also from this idea of needing to be in the process of change itself in order to be able to monitor and understand. So this idea of reconfiguring the way in which different principles are put together and organized over, and are mobilized and combined and reconfigured over time. Tracing those transition pathways, figuring out the way in which these pathways are constructed, how they're evolving, how they're interacting, and what the leverage points that emerge. Then also, of course, what everybody measures is the system performance of the food system, of the agricultural system. And the idea is that we're going to try to measure change across these 5 parts of a socio-technical system, hoping that we'll be able to see outcomes that are towards sustainable agroecological transformations. So I'm going to end. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. But basically, the question that I kind of posed in the beginning was about, do we think maybe the global food system is a situation ripe for change, ripe for intermediation? I hope so. I think so. The conditions are there. We're beginning to see the breakdowns in a lot of these infrastructures. We have a lot of controversies, but it also means that we have to pay attention to these relationships among the people and the things and the way in which they're interacting across the different scales. And it means that we have to really focus on these elements of the making and not reconstructing transitions once they're finished and legible, but actually studying them while they're still open, while they're still contested, and still capable of turning in a different direction. So this is the methodological commitment that I want to kind of adhere to and make, and invite everyone else to also think about and think how we can perhaps begin to work across all of our food systems around the world so that this meso level of change might be enough to create a tipping point. So thank you.
Thank you, Allison. I really appreciate your contributions here for the discussion. I collected and selected the questions. I will not read it because we need time. So I'll give you 5 minutes each one to react to the questions. Just before that, if anybody wants to go to the official dinner of the Congress tomorrow night, you need to do your registration for the dinner today. It's the last day for registration for the dinner. So 5 minutes, please, and good luck.
I have 4 questions, and I will answer them from easiest to hardest, so if I run out of time, it'll be on the hard one, and I won't have to answer it. Okay, first question was, could this produce a future in which small farmers become tenants instead of owning land? In a word, yes. And in fact, I think this is explicitly the future that the investment community foresees. There is, for instance, a white paper by the pension fund TIAA that it has the name something like separating production from ownership of the land base. And they explicitly are saying we should separate production from ownership of the land base. And not only do they think it's inevitable that they will own the land base and farmers will do the farming as tenants, but they actually think farmers want that. They argue, I talk about this in my book, it's a really prominent narrative among the investment community that farmers no longer want to own land. That farming is a business, and the best way to expand your business is to rent a larger number of acres rather than owning a smaller number of acres, and farmers just aren't that interested in owning land anymore, which I think is hilarious. 2, how does this relate to democracy? Is it democratic when finance or technology actors are deciding the future of food without public input? Again, this is an easy one. No, it's not democratic. I think this is very aligned with trends that we see in national politics. When Trump was elected the second time, we saw these tech oligarchs, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos lining up behind him and sort of bowing down. Jeff Bezos announced that the Washington Post, the paper he controls, would now have an opinion section devoted to the benefits of free trade and individual liberties. We're seeing this like alignment of elite class interests behind authoritarianism. And this comes out in relation to farmland specifically, and I think this is very aligned with the real hubris of the tech sector. We see, for instance, in California, a major project came to light in the news a couple of years ago where a bunch of tech billionaires, led by a founder of Google, had acquired thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land secretly, had bought it from farmers in Solano County in order to build, and this is land zoned for agriculture, to build a planned city that would be the perfect planned city of the future for all the tech workers to live in. And this land is zoned for agriculture, but they just are confident that they'll be able to bully their way through to getting it zoned as an urban area and build their planned city. So no, it's not democratic. 3, hold on. Someone asked if I could speak to the intersection between these two waves, the intersection of land concentration, financialization, and agricultural digitalization. Yes, absolutely. I've kind of presented them as two waves, but there's a real Venn diagram where in the middle we see these new ag tech startups being developed specifically, essentially to enable land concentration, to enable large-scale landlordism. I was at a conference in 2017, an ag tech conference, researching ag tech, when all of a sudden I found myself watching a presentation that was specifically about the land management challenges faced by massive-scale landlords who own land on multiple continents, and specifically pitching AI technologies as the solution to enormous scale land management. So it's really kind of like the next generation of corporate solutions to overcoming the kind of barriers to capitalist penetration of agriculture. A really funny case of this was the startup Tillable, which was an ag data startup that that was working with FieldView, Monsanto's farm management company, and they had all this land data on farmers in the Midwest, and they sent letters to landlords offering to rent their farms, often at prices higher than their existing tenants were renting. And farmers got really up in arms about this because they said, are you using the information from our FieldView, from our crop management app, to figure out that our land is productive and snake it out from under us by writing to our landlords to get our land? And the companies denied this, and they broke up their platform partnership, and Tillable has since rebranded as Camo Ag, which seems really calculated to appeal to rural people. But it was a really interesting case of this like obvious overlap of different forms of rentiership, land rentiership and this kind of platform rentiership. Finally, do I have time for one more? Should I stop? Okay, this is the hard one, darn it. The question is it even possible for ag innovation to occur without this private sector involvement? Could the public sector alone sustain ag development sufficiently to meet global food demand? That's a tricky one, and I'm mostly a critic, so I haven't thought about it a lot. But I think, to me, the solution is not like getting rid of private sector innovation. It's more like a Polanyian re-embedding of this innovation in public life, right? There are suggestions, so tons of these companies have received government funding. You know, we think that startups like SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, got tons of government funding early on to get started, but the public gets none of that money. And so people like Mariana Mazzucato, I think, suggest that maybe there need to be public dividends. When government money has invested in early stage startups, the public has a stake in that startup just as the investors do, and the public should get some of those dividends back. There's also the potential for nonprofit incubators. There is one kind of counterexample in Silicon Valley, a nonprofit incubator, it's called Food System 6, that does this kind of incubation of for-profit startups, but in the same cohort, it will have like food justice nonprofits. And it decenters its investment from the ability to make really big profits. So I think there are sort of alternative models out there of doing innovation, and the challenge is not to get rid of private sector innovation. If anything, it's to free these really creative and idealistic entrepreneurs to actually do idealistic stuff with their awesome technologies rather than be roped into the same existing systems, the same existing status quo in the service of incumbents. Okay.
Okay, yes. 4 questions. First is about the role of technology developing place in advancing food self-sufficiency. Yes, indeed. China, we have a slogan saying that to ensure food security by 2 measures. First is to secure the red line of the land. You have to have the land. Second is by technology. So this policy has been implemented by a very lot of different measures. For instance, the financial support to the technology development, to agricultural university, to students in agricultural university to go into the field. For instance, in China, we have so-called science or technology yard. Is to build a place that the researcher and students from agricultural university can work closely with the peasants in the field and see what problem they have, and then you just do experiments in the field, for instance. So we do have quite concrete, comprehensive measures to develop our technology in order to develop our food security. Second, does energy transition policy impact on land use? Yes, definitely. But the energy development in China, first of all, China, we are very serious on green energy transition. We have a lot of this kind of photovoltaic and wind generation. Somebody, they said, oh, China only built this machine, they never built the wind generation. It's wrong. We have so many fields. You know whom said these things, It's the president. Donald Trump said that China, you only see they produce machines, they never build the wind generation things. No, indeed, we have so many areas, But we do not do so many like the ethanol mass production. It's not so important in China for that. So land use impact by energy transition, mainly by this photovoltaic building, but it's mostly the mountainous area, the wasted land. It's not really the farmland area. But of course, wind generation, it also impacts a bit, but it does not harm too much of the food security thing and the major land use of the grain production. Third is how China is supporting transition from conventional to agroecology practice. I tell you that Yang Dao did a lot of research in China, and he made the conclusion that for European agriculture, it was from, the transition is from modern agriculture to more ecological friendly agriculture. But China, our agriculture was traditionally agroecological practice by the peasants. And only when we have such kind of modern farming concept coming. So it's not really to support the transition, but we protect the sport peasant farming. I think that will do very much to the agroecology practice already. Question 4 is about Chinese institution to support to improve the low quality arable land. I know, who raised this question, know very much about China, In fact, I did prepare this kind of thing in my presentation, but I was asking Paulo many times how long my presentation is because there are so many things that is connected. Yes, we have comprehensive policy and real investment. to improve, to develop the high quality farmland. We have developed 1.5 billion more of high quality farmland already to ensure the basic security of food to achieve the so-called the self-sufficiency, absolute self-sufficiency of grain production. So this indeed, I mean, about China is a lot of background information, is a lot to say, but because of time limitation, I just want to say that we have a working group 34. It's mostly Chinese speakers. I don't want it's purely Chinese people discussing with Chinese people, otherwise we could do in China. So it's mainly the Chinese speakers, and you are welcome to go there. And we also have sent to the organizer, we have a China special session on which day. So you are also welcome. And I know in the afternoon, Professor Li, who is very established scholar, is doing China Global Alliance, China's efforts, but also Global Alliance efforts to combat hunger. So I just like advisement to welcome you, join all these sessions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick because I was very long in my presentation. So I have 3 questions that are all about the intermediation process itself. So how does it arise? How do you deal with power? And how do you, and do non-humans have a role? So what we were thinking about in this clarification of these situations that are kind of ripe for change, that's where the intermediation arises. So that's where when you have certain types of either controversies or uncertainties or complexities that the actors began to recognize and began to deal with and try and identify as challenges to the work that they're doing, that's when the intermediation emerges. And one of the points that comes out of this and other work that we've been doing is that these are not professional intermediaries, right? These are not the knowledge brokers that we know about in the literature. These are interested individuals who are in a particular situation. They can come from any part of that food system who's a part of this dialogue and takes a role in then intermediating and therefore, in a sense, resolving that challenge. And this is where the question of the non-human actors and the power comes in, because sometimes these are documents, sometimes these are the bees themselves. These are the types of actors that if you pay attention to the role that they played in identifying maybe a breakdown in the infrastructure, this was a way in which the actors then realized that they had a chance to make a change. And so the power issue is always difficult. Because people and objects, they come into every situation with a different, let's say, baggage about the type of power they have in a particular situation. One of the things that comes out in what we've been examining is that you do have that, let's say, flexibility in these negotiation processes where it's not always let's say, the most powerful in the typical sense that emerges having won the debate. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and so it really depends. And so you have to kind of, in a sense, go in through that lens of being open for understanding those relational back and forth, because indeed small wins might actually not be the big win in the end. So that's just, again, a methodological point. So thank you.
We'll be back for working groups at 1:45. You can take a look at the website. We have several suggestions of restaurants nearby. And after the working groups, 4 o'clock, we have 5 different parallel panels. Please take a look on the program to see which one do you wanna participate. Thank you very much.